Lake Forest, Illinois, Christmas Eve. The wind strips the warmth from the brick, but inside, the fire is lit and the wine is poured. My name is Danielle Ross, and I am watching my parents celebrate a theft. On the table between the crystal and the silver sits a contract that values my forgotten trash at $250,000. They think they have secured their future. I know they have sold a ticking time bomb of rotting cardboard and stolen images. The phone is in my hand and the buyer is on the line. One word from me saves them, but the truth will cost them everything. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. The wind came off the lake in hard, flat sheets. It stripped the warmth from the engine block of my rental car the moment I killed the ignition. Lake Forest was always like this in December. Beautiful, expensive, and cold enough to hurt your lungs if you breathe too deep. I sat in the driveway for a minute looking at the house. It was a colonial 2-story brick and white trim, lit up like a showroom. Wreaths hung in every window, each one identical, bound in red velvet ribbon that cost more by the yard than the canvas I used for my sketches. I checked my face in the rearview mirror. I looked tired, but the good kind of tired. The kind that comes from 3 months of solo shows in New York and a gallery opening in Berlin. I was 29. I had money in the bank that I had made with my own hands. I didn't need to be here. I didn't need the roast beef or the criticism or the heavy silence that usually filled the spaces between courses. But it was Christmas, and there is a gravity to family that pulls you back even when you know you should stay in orbit. I got out of the car. The snow crunched under my boots, a dry, snapping sound. I walked up the path that had been shoveled clean, the salt crystals grinding against the pavement. Before I could knock, the door opened. My mother stood there. She was wearing a green silk dress I hadn't seen before. Her hair was done stiff and blonde, holding its shape against the draft from the open door. "Danielle," she said. She didn't hug me. She stepped back and gestured me inside like I was a client arriving for a consultation. "You're late. The roads." "The flight," I said. I stepped into the foyer. O'Hare was backed up. The heat hit me first. It was stifling, smelling of cinnamon pine and old wood polish. I dropped my bag by the coat rack. My father came out of the living room. He held a tumbler of scotch in one hand. He looked older than I remembered, a little heavier around the waist, his face flushed with the kind of permanent ruddiness that comes from high blood pressure and good liquor. "Danny," he said. He shook my hand. His grip was loose, damp. "Good to see you. Let me take your coat." I handed him my coat. "Hello, Dad." "You look thin," my mother said. She was already inspecting me, her eyes moving over my boots, my jeans, the paint splatter I'd missed on my left cuff. "Do you eat in the city, or is it just cigarettes and turpentine?" "I eat," I said. "I eat fine." We moved into the living room. This was where the first thing felt wrong. The last time I was here 2 years ago, the carpet had been a faded beige loop pile that smelled like wet dog. Now there was a Persian rug covering the floor, thick and intricate deep reds and blues that absorbed the light. The old sofa was gone, replaced by a sectional in dark leather that looked Italian. The walls had been repainted a slate gray, and there was crown molding where there used to be water stains. I took the glass my father offered me. It was neat. I smelled it. Lagavulin, 16-year. My father used to drink blended whiskey from a plastic handle because he said single malt was for people who liked to burn money. "New rug," I said. My mother smoothed her dress. She sat on the edge of the leather chair, crossing her legs. "We decided it was time for an update. The house was falling apart. You know how it is. You have to maintain the asset." "Must have cost a fortune," I said. I took a sip. The smoke and peat hit the back of my throat. It was excellent. "We manage," my father said. He sat opposite me, swirling his glass. "We've had some good fortune recently. Some investments finally paid out. Smart moves. Things we planted a long time ago." I watched him. He avoided my eyes, looking instead at the Christmas tree in the corner. It was 12 feet tall, grazing the ceiling, covered in glass ornaments. There was a tension in his shoulders that didn't match the casual talk of investments. My parents were retired teachers. They had pensions, not portfolios. For 10 years, every phone call had been a litany of complaints about property taxes, the cost of heating oil, and how the price of ground beef was criminal. Now they were drinking $80 scotch on a $5,000 rug. "I'm glad to hear it," I said. "It looks good." "And you?" my mother asked. "How is the art?" She said the word art, the way one might say infection. For years, my career was the punchline of the family joke. When I was in art school, they told me I was wasting my life. When I sold my first piece, they asked if I had a backup plan. When I got reviewed in the Times, they asked if I had health insurance. "It's good," I said. "Busy. I have a show opening in Chicago in February. Paradox Gallery." "Paradox," my father said, testing the word. "Is there money in that?" "Enough," I said. "I paid off my loans last month." They exchanged a look. It was quick, a flicker of eyes meeting and darting away, but I caught it. It was the look of two people confirming a shared secret. "That's wonderful," my mother said, her voice tight. "Really, we always knew you had talent. We just worried about the practicalities. The market is so fickle." "It is," I agreed, "but I'm doing okay." "Better than okay, I'd bet," my father said. He leaned forward. "I read an article online about that auction in London. A girl from New York selling paintings for 6 figures, abstract stuff, splatters." "That wasn't me, Dad. That was a different artist." "But you're in that world," he pressed. "The prices are real. People actually pay that." "Sometimes," I said. I put my glass down on the coaster. The conversation felt like an interrogation disguised as small talk. They were hunting for a number. They wanted to know what I was worth. "It depends on the provenance, the history of the work, the demand." "Provenance," my mother repeated. She smiled, a thin expression that didn't show her teeth. "That's an interesting word. Origins matter." The room felt airtight. The fire in the hearth was gas blue flames licking at ceramic logs. It gave off heat, but no sound. I looked around the room again. On the mantel where my high school graduation photo used to be, there was now a crystal vase with winter berries. Everything that marked this house as the place I grew up, the clutter, the mismatched furniture, the stack of Reader's Digest, was gone. It had been staged. It felt like walking into an open house for a property that had already been sold. "So," I said, shifting the subject, "what's the plan for dinner? Do you need help in the kitchen?" "It's all done," my mother said. "Catered mostly. I just have to carve the roast. We wanted tonight to be nice, special, just the three of us." "Catered?" I asked. My mother had never paid for cooking in her life. She prided herself on making a turkey stretch for a week. "Relax, Danielle," my father said. He stood up and walked to the sideboard to pour himself another drink. The bottle clinked heavy against the glass. "Let us spoil you. You're the successful daughter now. We want to show you we appreciate that. We appreciate you." He turned back to me. His face was flushed darker now. "Actually, we've been doing a lot of cleaning since we did the renovations, clearing out the junk, making space." "That's good," I said. "You guys had a lot of stuff." "We found your old things," my mother said. She picked at a loose thread on the arm of the chair, though I couldn't see one. "In the attic. The boxes you left when you moved to the city. The canvases." I felt a prickle of irritation. I had left those boxes there 7 years ago. "I told you to throw those out. It was just student work, practice material. I didn't have room in the studio apartment." "Throw them out." My father laughed. It was a dry, cracking sound. "You don't throw out potential, Danny. You don't throw out history." "It wasn't history," I said. "It was garbage, copies, studies, bad lighting and worse perspective." "Well," my mother said. She stood up, smoothing her skirt again. "We didn't see it that way. We thought they were charming. We thought they showed promise." She walked over to the double doors that led to the dining room. She put her hand on the brass handle. "But that's for later. Let's eat. The food is getting cold and we have a surprise for dessert. I stood up. The scotch was warm in my stomach, but my hands felt cold. There was something about the way she said surprise that made my skin tight. It wasn't the excitement of a gift, it was the anticipation of a reveal. I'm not really hungry, I lied. Nonsense, my father said. He came up beside me, clapping a hand on my shoulder. His palm was heavy. It's Christmas, we're family, and we have a lot to celebrate, more than you know. He guided me toward the dining room. I walked with him, but I kept my eyes on the new Persian rug, watching the way the intricate patterns twisted and knotted over each other, creating a maze with no clear way out. I stepped over the threshold into the smell of roasted meat and the heavy sweet scent of lilies that filled the dining room. The table was set with the good silver, the stuff that was usually kept in a velvet-lined box under the bed, only brought out for weddings and funerals. I took my seat at the side of the table. My father sat at the head. My mother sat opposite him. I was the audience. The stage was set. I just didn't know the play yet. The roast beef was rare. When my mother sliced it, red juice ran out and pooled against the white porcelain of the serving platter. She served me 2 thick slices, ladling horseradish sauce over the meat with a silver spoon. The steam rose up, smelling of iron and heavy cream. We ate in silence for the first few minutes, the only sound the scrape of silverware against china and the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. The wine was a Cabernet deep and tannic. It coated the tongue. It was a $50 bottle. I knew because I had bought the same vintage for a client gift 3 weeks ago. My parents were drinking it like water. It's good meat, my father said, chewing slowly. Prime. From the butcher on State Street. Not that grocery store slop. It's excellent, I said. I cut a small piece. It tasted rich, almost metallic. Thank you. My mother put her fork down. She hadn't eaten much. She was watching me, her hands clasped under her chin, elbows on the table. Her eyes were bright, too bright, glittering with that frantic energy she always got when she had a secret she was desperate to tell, but determined to savor. Robert, she said softly. Tell her. My father wiped his mouth with a linen napkin. He took a long swallow of wine. He looked at me, then at the ceiling, then back at me. He looked like a man who had just won a bet he shouldn't have made. We had a visitor last month, he started. A man named Mr. Vane, Marcus Vane. The name meant nothing to me. A friend of yours? A collector, my father corrected. Private equity, I think, or real estate. He has a very large estate in Barrington. He's been following the art market. He's been following you. I stopped chewing. Me. He read about your show in Berlin. He likes your style, the brutalism of it. He called us, actually. Tracked us down through the phone book, if you can believe that. My father chuckled, a sound that lacked mirth. He wanted to know if we had any early works. Anything from before you were... commercial. I'm not commercial, Dad. Before you were known, he amended. The raw stuff, the origin story. I felt a cold prickle at the base of my neck. And what did you tell him? We told him the truth, my mother interjected. She leaned forward, the candlelight catching the gold chain around her neck. We told him we had the entire attic collection. That's what he called it. The lost years. The boxes, I said. My voice was flat. The garbage I told you to throw away. One man's trash, my father said. He reached into his jacket pocket. He came over. We showed him the canvases. There were 20 of them. The portraits, the landscapes, those dark ones you did during your sophomore year when you were going through that phase. I remembered those paintings. I remembered them vividly. I remembered the smell of the cheap turpentine and the way the student-grade oil paint felt like grease on the brush. I remembered the frustration, the anger of not knowing how to make my hands do what my eyes saw. He fell in love with them, my mother said. Her voice went up an octave. He said they were visceral, unfiltered. He said they showed the struggle of the artist. He made an offer, my father said. He pulled a folded document from his pocket. It was thick, stapled on blue legal backing. He placed it on the table between the salt shaker and the butter dish. He tapped it with his index finger. We sold them, Danny. I stared at the paper. You sold my paintings. We sold the collection, he said. All 20 pieces. For how much? My father smiled. It was a smile I had never seen on him before. It was the smile of a man who thinks he has finally cheated the system that kept him down. $250,000. The number hung in the air. It silenced the clock. It sucked the oxygen out of the room. 250,000, $250,000. He wired the money yesterday, my mother whispered. It's in the account, cleared. I looked at them, really looked at them. They didn't look like my parents anymore. They looked like strangers who had broken into my life and stolen the furniture. That's illegal, I said. You can't sell my work. I didn't authorize it. We found it, my father said, his voice hardening. It was in our house, abandoned property. You left it there for 7 years, Danielle. You didn't pay rent. You didn't pay for storage. In the eyes of the law, that's abandonment. It's not about the storage, I said. It's intellectual property. You don't own the copyright just because you own the canvas. Oh, stop it, my mother snapped. The sweetness vanished. Her face twisted into something sharp and ugly. Don't you dare talk to us about copyright. Who paid for the brushes? Who paid for the tuition? Who paid for that apartment in the city when you couldn't sell a sketch to save your life? We did. We invested in you, my father said. He picked up his knife and cut another piece of beef. For 30 years, we poured money into you. Braces, camps, that ridiculous liberal arts degree. And what did we get? You visit once a year. You don't call. You make money, and we're stuck here clipping coupons. So this is repayment? I asked. You liquidated my past to pay for your renovations. It's a return on investment, my father said. Mr. Vane was happy. We're happy. You should be happy. It gets your name out there. It raises your value. I reached out and took the document. My hand was steady. I was surprised by that. I felt a vibration in my chest, a hum of pure distilled rage, but my hands were steady. I opened the contract. It was a standard bill of sale but drafted by a high-end firm. I skimmed the legalese. Seller transfers all rights. Physical ownership. Then I saw the clause. Paragraph 4. Representations and warranties. I read it twice. The sellers Robert and Susan Ross represent and warrant that the works are the original, unique, and authentic creations of the artist Danielle Ross. The sellers warrant that the works are archival, one-of-a-kind original compositions and do not infringe upon the rights of any third party. I looked up. Did you read this? Of course, my father said. Standard boilerplate. And the addendum? I flipped to the back. There was an affidavit signed by both of them. We, the parents and authorized agents of Danielle Ross, guarantee the authenticity and provenance of these works as early originals. He asked if you knew. My father admitted, his eyes shifting to his wine glass. We told him you were eccentric, that you didn't like to deal with the business side. We told him we had your proxy, verbal proxy. You lied, I said. We smoothed the road, he countered. He wanted to buy. We wanted to sell. Don't be naive, Danielle. Business is about getting the deal done. I looked back at the contract. I thought about the attic. I thought about the paintings. I wasn't angry anymore. The anger had crystallized into something cold and sharp, like a piece of glass in the snow. Dad, I said quietly, do you know what a master study is? He frowned. What? In art school, I said. Sophomore year. We had a class called Technique and Replication. The assignment was to take a famous photograph or a painting by a contemporary master and copy it, stroke for stroke, to learn how they handled light, how they mixed color. So, those 20 canvases in the attic, I said, they aren't my compositions, they are copies, exact replicas. I pointed to the contract. You warranted that these are unique original creations. They aren't. They are plagiarized exercise sheets. I copied photos from National Geographic. I copied a Jasper Johns. I copied a photograph of an Afghan girl that is copyrighted by Steve McCurry. If I tried to sell those, I would be sued for copyright infringement. They have zero market value, actually less than zero. They are liability. My mother laughed nervously. You're just saying that. You're trying to scare us because you're mad we kept the money. I'm not finished, I said. I turned the page. You warranted that the works are archival. They've lasted this long, my father said. I painted them on unprimed cardboard scraps I pulled out of the university dumpster, I said. And I used student-grade oil paint mixed with linseed oil I bought at a hardware store. Do you know what happens to cheap oil on unprimed cardboard after 10 years? They didn't answer. The acid in the cardboard eats the paint, I explained. It's called delamination. The oil rots. Within 5 years, those paintings will turn black and flake off the backing. They are chemically unstable. They are rotting from the inside out. I closed the contract. I placed it back on the table next to the butter dish. You sold a man $250,000 worth of stolen intellectual property that is going to disintegrate on his wall, I said. And you signed a legal document guaranteeing that it wouldn't. My father stopped eating. The flush on his face drained away, leaving his skin the color of wet dough. He looked at the contract, then at me. He won't know, my father stammered. He's just a collector. He liked how they looked. He paid $250,000, I said. People who pay that much have appraisers. They have insurers. As soon as he tries to insure them, an expert is going to look at them. They will see the unprimed cardboard. They will recognize the compositions. They will Google the images. But we spent the money, my mother whispered. Her hand went to her mouth. We paid off the mortgage. We booked the cruise. The money is gone, Danielle. Then you have a problem, I said. You have to fix it, my father said. His voice was sudden, loud. He slammed his hand on the table. The silverware jumped. You're the artist. You can write a letter. You can sign a certificate. Tell him they are real. Tell him you meant to paint them that way. Call it appropriation art, or whatever the hell you people do. You want me to commit fraud? I asked. You want me to put my name, my professional reputation on a lie so you can keep money you stole. It's not stealing, my mother cried. We are your parents. We gave you everything. You owe us this. Just sign the paper, Danielle. Just tell him it's okay. I looked at them. I saw the fear in their eyes, but under the fear, I saw the entitlement. They truly believed that my life was a resource they could mine. They believed that my integrity was a currency they could spend. I picked up my wine glass. I took a sip. It was still good wine, but it tasted like vinegar now. I can't do that, I said. You will do that, my father said. He stood up. He was big, looming over the table, using the physical intimidation that had worked when I was 12. You will fix this. I am not losing this house because you want to play the tortured artist. You will call him. Now. Call him? I asked. Call him and tell him the paintings are masterpieces, my father demanded. Tell him we had the authority. I looked at the phone on the sideboard. It was an old landline, a cordless handset sitting in its cradle. Okay, I said. My parents exhaled. The tension in the room broke. My mother smiled, a shaky, relieved thing. Thank you, Danny. We knew you'd be reasonable. We knew you'd help family. Where is the number? I asked. It's on the invoice, my father said. He tapped the blue folder. Top right corner. I stood up. I walked to the sideboard. I picked up the phone. I pressed the talk button and listened for the dial tone. It was a clear, steady hum. I looked at the number on the paper. Marcus Vane. I dialed. My father sat back down, picking up his fork. He thought he had won. He thought I was calling to cover for him. He thought I was calling to lie. The line rang, once, twice. Vane residence, a woman's voice answered. Housekeeper. This is Danielle Ross, I said. My voice was calm, my hand was steady. I need to speak to Mr. Vane. It regards the purchase he made from my parents. One moment, Ms. Ross. I waited. My parents were watching me. My mother poured more wine, her hand shaking slightly. My father was chewing, his eyes fixed on me, expecting capitulation. Ms. Ross. A man's voice came on the line. It was deep-cultured but edged with impatience. "I've been trying to reach you. Your parents said you were unreachable." "I was in Berlin," I said. "I'm in Lake Forest now. I'm at the dinner table." "Good," Vane said. "I have the works hanging in my library. They are striking. But my appraiser is coming tomorrow morning. I need the certificates of authenticity. Your parents said you would forward them." I looked at my father. He gave me a nod, urging me on. "Go on," the nod said. "Lie for me." "Mr. Vane," I said into the phone, "there are no certificates." "Excuse me." "There are no certificates," I repeated clearly so the room could hear. "Because those paintings are not original works. They are unauthorized copies of copyrighted material, and they are painted on unstable substrate that is already decaying. You have been defrauded, Mr. Vane, and I am calling to tell you that I did not authorize the sale." The silence in the dining room was absolute. My father dropped his fork. It hit the china with a sound like a gunshot. "What?" Vane's voice was ice. "Are you telling me these are fakes?" "I'm telling you they are worthless," I said, "and the people who sold them to you knew it." I took the phone away from my ear. I held it out toward my father. "He wants to talk to you," I said. My father took the phone. He didn't snatch it. He accepted it with the slow, confused motion of a man being handed a live grenade. He held the handset away from his ear for a second, looking at the illuminated buttons before bringing it to his face. The room was so quiet I could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen 3 rooms away. The candles on the table flickered, casting long, wavering shadows against the slate-gray walls. My mother had stopped breathing. Her hand frozen halfway to her wine glass, her knuckles white. "Mr. Vane," my father said. His voice was too loud a boom of forced joviality that cracked at the edges. "Robert Ross here. I think there's been a miscommunication. Danielle is... she's joking. She has a very dry sense of humor. Artist temperament, you understand." He paused, listening. I watched his face. The ruddiness that had returned with the wine drained away instantly, leaving his skin the color of old parchment. His eyes widened, fixed on the centerpiece of winter lilies. He opened his mouth to speak, but the voice on the other end cut him off. I could hear the cadence of it, sharp staccato, relentless. It wasn't the voice of a man interested in humor. It was the voice of a man who managed risk for a living and had just discovered a breach. No, wait," my father stammered. He turned away from the table, hunched over the receiver, shielding it with his body, as if he could physically block the words from reaching us. "The contract. We signed the... Look, Marcus, let's be reasonable. The girl is sitting right here. She's just being difficult. The work is real. It's in your house." He listened again. He flinched. "Put her back on," my father said, his voice dull. He didn't look at me. He just extended his arm backward, holding the phone out blindly. "He wants you. He wants to hear the specifics." I took the phone. The plastic was warm from his grip. "Mr. Vane." "Ms. Ross," Vane said. His voice was terrifyingly calm now. "Your father claims you are being difficult. He claims the works are authentic. I am looking at the painting hanging above my fireplace right now. It is the portrait of the woman in the red scarf, the one he called Study in Crimson. Tell me exactly why you say this is a fraud, and be precise because I am recording this call." "It's not a Study in Crimson," I said. I looked at my mother. She was staring at her plate, pushing a piece of roast beef around in the congealing gravy. "It is a direct grid transfer copy of a photograph from the June 1985 issue of National Geographic. The photographer owns the copyright. I painted it for a class assignment on color theory. I didn't change the composition. I didn't alter the lighting. If you try to sell it, the estate of the photographer can sue you for copyright infringement. You don't own a piece of art. You own a piece of evidence." "Go on," Vane said. I could hear the scratch of a pen on paper. "The landscape," I continued. "The one with the melting clocks. That's a direct copy of a Dali, obviously, but the background is lifted from a Wyeth. It's a pastiche, plagiarism." But the legal issue isn't your biggest problem, Mr. Vane. The physical object is the problem. Explain, he commanded. My parents told you those were archival canvases, I said. They aren't. They are cardboard panels I cut from shipping boxes behind the university cafeteria. I primed them with house paint latex wall primer, not gesso. Latex and oil paint don't bond. They repel each other over time. I took a breath. The air in the room felt thin. Have you looked closely at the surface of the crimson portrait? Look at the lower left corner near the signature. There was a silence on the line. I imagined him walking to the fireplace, leaning in with a magnifying glass. I see it, Vane said. His voice was a low growl. Tiny cracks. Spiderwebbing. That's delamination, I said. The oil paint is shrinking as it dries, but the latex underneath is flexible. They are separating. Within 2 years, maybe 3, the paint will flake off in chunks. The cardboard itself is high acid. It will turn brittle and yellow, eating the pigment from behind. You bought works that are chemically designed to self-destruct. I see, Vane said. The pen scratched again, louder this time. And your parents? Were they aware of the materials used? They were aware I was a broke student fishing trash out of dumpsters, I said. They were aware I told them to throw those boxes away because they were junk. Whether they understood the chemistry is irrelevant. They signed a contract guaranteeing archival quality. They warranted originality. They sold you goods that failed on both counts. Indeed they did, Vane said. Put your father back on. I handed the phone back to my father. He took it with both hands this time. He looked smaller. The bluster was gone. He looked like a man who had been caught shoplifting. Marcus, my father whispered. Don't call me Marcus. Vane's voice barked loud enough for me to hear from my seat. You sold me trash, Robert. You looked me in the eye, shook my hand, and sold me rotting cardboard for $250,000. I didn't know, my father pleaded. I swear, I thought, she's successful now. I thought it was all the same. You signed the affidavit, Vane shouted. You guaranteed the provenance. That is fraud, Robert. That is grand larceny. That is a felony. We can work this out, my father said, sweat beading on his forehead. We can find a way to make it right. You will make it right, Vane said. I want my money back. All of it. The wire transfer is to be reversed immediately. I expect the funds in my account by 9 a.m. tomorrow. If the money isn't there, my lawyer files a suit for fraud and damages at 9:01, and I call the district attorney at 9:02. Do you understand me? The money, my father stammered. We moved it. Then move it back, Vane snapped. Sell the car, mortgage the house. I don't care. I want my $250,000 plus the $5,000 I paid for the appraisal that is now useless. You have 12 hours. The line clicked dead. The dial tone droned, a flat, monotonous sound that filled the dining room. My father slowly lowered the phone. He missed the cradle on the first try, the handset clattering against the wood of the sideboard before he managed to hang it up. He stood there for a long moment, his back to us, gripping the edge of the sideboard so hard his knuckles turned yellow. He wants the money, my father said to the wall. We don't have it, my mother whispered. She was trembling now, the vibrations shaking the table slightly. We paid off the credit cards. We paid the contractor for the bathroom. We paid the deposit on the cruise. We sent the rest to the retirement fund. It's locked up. There are penalties. He doesn't care about penalties, my father roared. He spun around, his face twisted into a mask of fury. He looked at me. This is your doing. My doing, I asked. I picked up my knife and fork. I cut a small piece of the potato on my plate. It was cold. You sabotaged us, he spat. He walked toward the table, his movements jerky. You got on that phone and you poisoned him. You told him the paint was bad. You told him about the photos. Why? Why would you do that? Because it's the truth, I said. And because I protect my name. Your name? My mother laughed, a high, hysterical sound. We gave you that name, we fed you, we clothed you, and you would destroy us over some cardboard. You committed fraud, I said calmly. You forged my authorization. You lied about the quality of the goods. You were greedy and you were lazy. You didn't want to ask me because you knew I'd say no. You wanted the money and you didn't care if you had to steal my reputation to get it. We didn't steal anything, my father shouted. He grabbed his wine glass and hurled it at the fireplace. It shattered against the brick, a spray of glass and red wine staining the new gray paint. We are your parents. We are entitled to a return. We raised you. Raising a child isn't a loan, I said. It's an obligation. You don't get to foreclose on me because you're retired and bored. You could have saved us, my mother sobbed. Tears were running down her face, ruining her makeup. You could have just lied, Danny. Just one little lie. He never would have known. The paint, maybe it wouldn't peel. Maybe he wouldn't notice. You could have signed the paper and we would be safe. We would be happy. He would have known, I said. Rich men aren't stupid. He would have found out eventually. And when he did, if I had signed that paper, he wouldn't just sue you. He would sue me. He would destroy my career. I would be the artist who sells fakes. I would be finished. You were willing to burn my future to pay for your past. You selfish bitch, my father said. He leaned over the table, his face inches from mine. I could smell the scotch and the fear on him. You ungrateful, cold-hearted bitch. We are ruined. Do you understand ruined? We can't pay him. We'll have to sell the house. I know, I said. The market is soft right now. You might have to price it aggressively. He stared at me, stunned by my lack of reaction. He was waiting for me to break. He was waiting for the daughter who used to cry when they yelled, the daughter who used to beg for approval. But that daughter wasn't at the table. She had been painted over layer by layer with years of work and solitude. You have 12 hours, I reminded him. You should probably call the bank or a realtor. You're not going to help us, my mother asked. Her voice was small like a child's. You have money. You said so. You paid off your loans. You could write him a check. You could buy the paintings back. I looked at her. I saw the manipulation, naked and desperate. She wanted me to buy my own garbage to save them from the consequences of their theft. I don't buy forgeries, I said, and I don't negotiate with terrorists, even if they're related to me. My father straightened up. He looked at me with pure hatred. Get out. I haven't finished my dinner, I said. Get out, he screamed, his voice cracking. Get out of my house. You are no daughter of mine. I don't want to see your face. I don't want to hear your name. You won't, I said. My name is a trademark now. You can't afford it. I stood up. I placed my napkin on the table, folding it neatly next to the plate. The room was heavy with the smell of spilled wine and ruin. The ambush had failed. The trap they had set for me had snapped back on their own ankles. They were bleeding out, and they were shocked that I wasn't rushing to bandage the wound. The paintings, I said, pausing by the door. Make sure you get them back from Vane when you refund him. You'll need to dispose of them properly. They're hazardous waste. My father didn't answer. He was slumped in his chair, his head in his hands. My mother was weeping silently, rocking back and forth. I looked at the Christmas tree twinkling in the corner, oblivious to the carnage. It was a beautiful tree, perfectly decorated, perfectly fake. I walked out of the dining room, my boots echoing on the hardwood of the foyer. I didn't look back. There was nothing there for me anymore. Just a house full of things bought with money they didn't have, and a family held together by debts they couldn't pay. The climax had passed. The explosion was over. Now came the silence. The foyer was colder than the dining room. The heat from the gas fire didn't reach this far, and the draft from the front door seeped through the weather stripping. I'm sure they had paid a contractor $3,000 to install. I walked to the coat rack. My coat was a heavy wool trench charcoal gray tailored. I put it on, slowly buttoning it from the bottom up. I checked my pockets. Keys, phone, wallet. The holy trinity of leaving. Behind me, the dining room was silent for a long time, and then I heard the scuff of footsteps. Not the heavy, angry stomp of my father, but the shuffling, uneven gait of people who have suddenly become very old. They came into the hallway. My mother looked like a ghost. The color had drained so completely from her face that her makeup stood out like grease paint on a mannequin. She didn't look at me. She looked at the floor, at the slate tiles, as if searching for a trap door. My father leaned against the archway. The rage had evaporated, replaced by a hollow, vibrating terror. The scotch was working on him now, not as a fuel, but as a sedative that wasn't strong enough to numb the reality of what he had done. "You can't just leave," my mother said. Her voice was a whisper brittle as dried leaves. She sat down on the bottom step of the main staircase, gathering the skirt of her green silk dress around her knees. "It's Christmas Eve, Danielle. It's snowing. You can't just drive away." "I have snow tires," I said. I wound my scarf around my neck. "And I have a hotel in the city." "We're going to lose the house," my father said. He wasn't talking to me, really. He was saying it out loud to see if the words would kill him. "Vane isn't bluffing. I know men like that. He'll have a lien on the property by noon tomorrow. He'll freeze the accounts. He'll take the pension." "He will," I agreed. I pulled my leather gloves out of my pocket. "He'll sue for the principal, the interest, legal fees, and punitive damages. Fraud is an intentional tort. Bankruptcy won't discharge it. He'll garnish your income until you die." My father looked at me then. His eyes were wet, red-rimmed. "You know this. You know exactly what he'll do. And you're just going to watch." "I'm watching gravity work, Dad. You stepped off the ledge. I didn't push you." "We did it for you," my mother cried out, a sudden burst of energy that faded as quickly as it came. "We wanted to be proud of you. We wanted to tell our friends that our daughter was a success, that her work was valuable." "Is that a crime?" "Yes," I said. "Technically it is. It's called forgery and theft by deception." I walked over to the mirror hanging above the console table. I adjusted my collar. I looked at myself. I looked the same as I had when I walked in, but I felt lighter. The burden of their expectation, the heavy, suffocating weight of owing them for my existence was gone. They had tried to cash out my life, and the check had bounced. "How much do you actually have?" I asked, looking at their reflection in the mirror. "Liquid. Right now." My father rubbed his face. 4,000 in checking, maybe 10 in the money market. The rest is tied up or spent. The renovation. The roof cost 40,000. The kitchen was 60. We wanted it to be nice. We wanted to live like people who had made it. "You spent $250,000 in a month." "It goes fast," he whispered. "Debts. We had debts, Danny. Credit cards. The line of credit on the house. We were drowning. This money. It was a life raft. We thought you'd be happy. We thought you'd see it as us finally getting a break." "A break," I repeated. I turned to face them. "You thought selling my student exercises as masterpieces was a break. You didn't think about the collector. You didn't think about my reputation. You just saw a pile of cash and thought you deserved it because you've been unhappy for 30 years. "We haven't been unhappy," my mother protested weakly. "You've been miserable," I said. "You've spent your whole lives buying things to cover up the fact that you hate where you ended up. The rugs, the cars, the scotch. It's all costume jewelry, and when you ran out of money to buy costumes, you decided to sell me." My father pushed himself off the doorframe. He walked toward me. He didn't look threatening anymore. He looked pathetic. He reached out a hand, palm up. "Danny," he said, "please, I'm begging you. I am 68 years old. I can't go to court. I can't lose this house. It's all we have. It's who we are." "It's a building," I said. "It's wood and brick. It's not who you are. Who you are is the man who looked a stranger in the eye and lied for money." "Loan us the money," he said. The desperation made his voice crack. "You have it. You said you're successful. Write the check to Vane. We'll pay you back. We'll set up a payment plan. $50 a month, whatever we can squeeze out of Social Security. Please, just make it go away. I don't have $250,000 in cash sitting in a checking account, Dad. My net worth is in my inventory, in my studio, and even if I did, I wouldn't give it to you. Why? He pleaded. Why are you so cold? Is it the art school? Did they teach you to hate your family? They taught me that value comes from work, I said. They taught me that you can't cheat the canvas. If the structure is bad, the painting collapses. If the perspective is wrong, the illusion fails. You can't talk your way out of a bad painting. It just is. I looked at my mother still huddled on the stairs. She was weeping silently, her face buried in her hands. You want me to pay for your mistake, I said. You want me to act like the savior. But if I bail you out, you'll never learn. You'll just find another way to leverage me. Next year it'll be borrowing my name for a loan, or selling interviews to tabloids. You don't respect the work. You only respect the price tag. That's not true, she sobbed. It is true. You didn't care about those paintings when they were in the attic. You called them trash. You only cared when a man in a suit offered you a check. You don't know the difference between value and price, and that is why you're broke. My father dropped his hand. He looked at me with a sudden dawning comprehension. He realized finally that the transaction was closed. There was no negotiation. You're going to let him destroy us, he said. I'm going to let him sue you, I corrected. Whether that destroys you is up to you. You can sell the house. You can move to a condo. You can live within your means. It won't be pretty and it won't be comfortable, but it will be real. You'll be living a life you can actually afford. I'd rather be dead, he said bitterly. That's the Hemingway in you talking, I said dryly. But you're not a tragedy, Dad. You're just a cautionary tale about living on credit. I pulled my gloves on tight. The leather creaked. The sound was loud in the silent hall. One last thing, I said. If Vane calls me again, I'm going to tell him exactly where I keep my real archives. I'm going to send him a catalog of my actual work, because unlike you, I treat my collectors with respect. I don't sell them lies. You care more about a stranger than your own blood, my mother spat. The sadness had curdled back into venom. It was easier for her to hate me than to hate herself. I care about the truth, I said. A painter signs their name to the truth. That signature on the canvas is a contract. It says, I saw this, I made this, I stand by this. You forged my signature. You signed my name to a lie. You have to buy it back. That's how the market works. I put my hand on the doorknob. The brass was cold. Where will you go? My father asked. He sounded exhausted. Home, I said. To my studio. I have work to do. I have a show in February. Real paintings, on real canvas. Don't come back, he said. If you walk out that door, don't you ever come back. I won't, I said. I don't have a reason to. I've got everything I need. I opened the door. The wind hit me instantly, a physical blow. Snow swirled into the foyer, landing on the slate and melting instantly into dark, wet spots. The cold was shocking cleansing. It smelled of ice and pine needles, sharp and clean, compared to the stifling, expensive potpourri smell of the house. I looked back at them one last time. My mother, a puddle of green silk on the stairs. My father, a shadow in the doorway holding an empty glass. They looked like figures in a painting that had been left out in the rain, blurred, indistinct, their edges dissolving. They were trapped in the frame they had built for themselves. Merry Christmas, I said. I stepped out and closed the door. The latch clicked shut. It was a solid, heavy sound, the sound of a vault closing. I walked down the path. The snow was coming down harder now, filling in my footprints as soon as I made them. By morning there would be no sign that I had been here at all. The wind bit at my face, stinging my cheeks, but it felt good. It felt real. I reached the rental car. It was covered in a thin layer of white. I brushed off the driver's side window with my gloved hand. Inside, the leather seats were stiff with cold. I got in and started the engine. The dashboard lit up a constellation of artificial lights. I turned on the heater, the wipers, the headlights. I sat there for a moment, letting the engine warm up. I looked at the house. The lights were still on. It looked warm and inviting from the outside. A perfect American home. A lie in brick and mortar. I put the car in reverse. The tires spun for a second on the ice, then caught. I backed out of the driveway, away from the wreaths and the renovations and the debt. I turned the wheel and pointed the car toward the highway, toward the city, toward the cold, empty studio where the air smelled of turpentine and linseed oil, and where everything on the walls was true. The highway was a black ribbon cutting through the white noise of the storm. I kept the speedometer at exactly 55, the wipers beating a steady, hypnotic rhythm against the glass. Slap drag, slap drag. The further I got from Lake Forest, the easier it was to breathe. The constriction in my chest, that tight iron band that had been there since I walked into my parents' foyer, began to loosen. It wasn't relief exactly. It was the sensation of a fever breaking the sweat, cooling on the skin, the clarity returning after the delirium. I watched the headlights of the oncoming traffic. They were just streaks of light, momentary and meaningless. I thought about the house I had left behind. In my mind, I could see the layout of the rooms like a blueprint. I saw the dining room with the spilled wine and the uneaten roast. I saw the living room with the expensive rug that was now just a depreciation asset. I imagined the silence that had settled over them. By now the shock would be wearing off, replaced by the crushing mechanics of their reality. I ran the numbers in my head. It was a habit I had picked up from the gallery owners I dealt with. If Vane filed suit tomorrow, the legal fees alone would drain their liquid cash in a month. They would try to settle, but Vane wasn't a settler. He was a collector. He collected things, and when he was wronged, he collected scalps. He would take the house. It was inevitable. The math was simple. They had leveraged a lie against a man who could afford to buy the truth, and they had lost. I didn't feel guilty. That was the thing that surprised me. I waited for the guilt to come, the old Catholic guilt that had been installed in me alongside the multiplication tables, but it didn't arrive. Instead, I felt a strange, cold purity. I had cut the line. I had severed the limb to save the body. For years, they had been a slow leak in my hull, a constant low-level drain of emotional energy and expectation. They wanted me to be their retirement plan, their trophy, their validation. Tonight, they had tried to cash me in, and I had refused to be currency. The suburbs gave way to the industrial sprawl of the city outskirts. The pristine, snow-covered lawns of the North Shore vanished, replaced by salt-stained concrete barriers and billboards for personal injury lawyers. This was the real world. It was ugly, functional, and honest. I merged onto the Kennedy Expressway. The skyline of Chicago rose up in the distance, a grid of amber and white lights against the heavy gray of the clouds. It looked like a circuit board. It looked like work. My phone buzzed in the cup holder. I glanced at it. Mom. I let it ring. It buzzed 4 times, vibrating against the plastic, and then stopped. A minute later, it buzzed again. Dad. I reached over, picked up the phone, and held down the power button. The screen went black. I tossed it onto the passenger seat. I didn't need to hear what they had to say. It would be bargaining. It would be threats. It would be the frantic, drowning noise of people who refused to learn how to swim. I had given them the life jacket of the truth, and they had chosen to hold on to the anchor of their pride. I took the exit for the West Loop. The streets here were narrower, the buildings brick and timber, old factories, converted into lofts and workspaces. The snow hadn't been plowed here yet. It was mashed into a brown sludge by the delivery trucks. I navigated the potholes by memory, turning down the alleyway behind my building. I parked in my spot between a dumpster and a rusted fire escape. I killed the engine. The silence rushed in, heavy and absolute. I sat there for a moment, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. I was alone. I was completely, utterly alone. And it was the most luxurious feeling in the world. I got out of the car. The wind here was sharper, cutting through the alleys, carrying the smell of exhaust and freezing metal. I walked to the service entrance, keyed in the code, and waited for the heavy steel door to buzz. It clicked, I pushed it open and stepped into the freight elevator. I rode it up to the fourth floor. The cage rattled and shook, the gears grinding with a sound that I loved. It was the sound of industry. When the doors opened, I walked down the long concrete hallway to Unit 404. My key slid into the lock with a smooth, oiled precision. I opened the door and flipped the switch. The studio was freezing. I kept the thermostat at 60 to save money, and because the cold kept the oil paint from drying too fast. The air smelled of turpentine linseed oil and damar varnish, the holy incense of my life. The space was cavernous, 1,000 square feet of raw concrete floors and exposed brick. There was no Persian rug, there were no leather sofas. There was a cot in the corner, a hot plate, a coffee maker, and a work table covered in tubes of paint rags and palette knives. And there were the paintings. They were stacked against the walls, wrapped in glassine. The ones on the easels were uncovered. Large, aggressive canvases. Violent strokes of gray and black slashed with sudden, shocking veins of red. They were ugly. They were difficult. They were true. I walked to the center of the room. I didn't take off my coat. I stood there breathing in the solvent fumes, letting them scrub the scent of the pine potpourri from my lungs. I looked at the large canvas on the main easel. It was a study of a building collapse I had seen on the news, rendered in abstraction. It was structural, chaotic, and mathematically precise in its destruction. It was worth more than my parents' house, but they would never understand why. They saw art as a decoration, something to hang over the sofa to match the drapes. They didn't understand that art was a record of survival. I walked over to the work table. I picked up a palette knife. The blade was flexible steel stained with dried blue pigment. I tested the edge against my thumb. It was sharp. I thought about the attic collection, the rotting cardboard, the stolen images, the lies. They were ash now. They were kindling that had burned up the bridge between me and my past. I was glad they were gone. I was glad the illusion was shattered. I looked around the empty freezing room. This was my inheritance. Not the debt, not the guilt, not the expectations. This space, this silence, this freedom to make something that didn't exist before. I walked to the window and looked out at the city. The snow was still falling, dusting the rooftops, covering the grime of the streets in a temporary white sheet. Somewhere out there in the suburbs, a house was collapsing. A family was imploding. A check was bouncing. I turned away from the window. I went to the coffee maker and turned it on. I listened to the water hiss as it boiled. I wasn't tired. I felt wide awake. I took off my coat and hung it on a nail by the door. I rolled up my sleeves. I squeezed a line of fresh titanium white onto my palette. It shone under the track lights, bright and uncompromising. I picked up a brush. I had work to do. As the last echoes of the city fade into the background, Danielle Ross settles into the quiet clarity of her studio, the weight of the past finally lifted from her shoulders. If you enjoyed this exploration of integrity and justice, please subscribe and share your reactions below. We read every single comment of your thoughts. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Revenge Hour. We'll see you next time.